All right, let's get started. I think we've got a quorum of attendees. So yeah, I think just to add on to what Scott was saying, thank you so much everyone for jumping on. We wanted to do this for a couple of reasons, and sort of as the week progressed, a bunch of new things happened. So we kind of changed the webinar a little bit to reflect it. So obviously, most of you guys would have at least seen or heard about the GPA changes, and might have seen some of the petitions and groups that have been set up, many of them from Fraser's alums, which we'll talk about. But also there have been interesting things coming out of the initial GAMSAT sits, and also some of the universities have finally changed their position on interviews and have given some clarity around how their interviews are going to run this year. So it's going to be kind of a mixed bag. And I love this Bernie Sanders meme. Gotta love Christian. All right. Yeah, so I also love this meme. I think it really represents how you guys must be feeling at the moment, constantly changing, trying to keep yourself afloat, if your medical dream is the box, so to speak. So we're going to talk about first GPAs, what has changed, why it's changed, and have, I think, a constructive conversation between Scott and myself, maybe reflecting the different parties. Point 2 will be about GAMSAT, just some insider info and some things we've heard from friends and people who've sat the test, state of interviews, and then Q&A. And I think Q&A will probably run for the longest part of the session. All right, so let's talk about GPAs. So there was an update released by the consortium on the 5th of May, and there's been a series of addendums. But I guess the bottom line is that most of the schools, not all, but most of the schools at some level have excluded 2020 study in GPA calculations. I guess the most important of them being University of Melbourne and Deakin, for a lot of our students from Melbourne based. And there are a couple of exceptions. So ANU are keeping 2020 results. Griffith have opted for an opt-in, opt-out system, and Macquarie shifted after some of the campaigning. So I'm gonna represent the negative in this conversation, just for, I guess, the point of representing the medical schools, and I'll pose the mathematical reasons why this is the case, but then we can talk a little bit about ethically why it's quite flawed. So I guess from a mathematical perspective, if I was a mathematician representing the GEMSAS medical schools, what they're seeking is to find a way to equitably and fairly rank students on a bell curve and try to do everything in my power to avoid unpredictability or things that would skew results in a way that I wouldn't get the best students in my medical school, because that's the ultimate goal, right? It's not just the students who study the hardest in third year or the students who planned X, Y, Z to happen on a certain year. It's just the students who, by whatever metric you define, are going to be the best doctors. Okay, so I think Scott and I agree that the GAMSAT is probably, it has its own flaws, but like it's specifically designed to do that. It's meant to be an aptitude test to achieve exactly that. I think interviews are also quite well designed to do that. I think GPAs are probably the ones that have always been the worst at identifying, the best potential medical people, because GPAs are so challenging depending on which schools you do it at, how it's calculated, how hard different units are. Like, it's very hard to make it a fair metric. And so given there's so much heterogeneity in the way that different universities have changed curriculums, unit structures, grading, the easiest way as a mathematician would just be to say, let's just discount it altogether. It's completely erratic and unpredictable. I don't know how this is going to affect my pretty bell curves. Let's just remove it. So I think, and all the future doctors listening to this should have the ability to, put that empathetic hat on and understand why the medical schools have taken that position. But let's look at the response that happened, and Scott can provide the other opinion, and I'll explain why I agree with it as well. So the response. Scott, do you want to add in here?
Yeah, sure. So I think that's Tom's assessment is reasonable. It is looking at it from I would argue, a very purely quantitative perspective. But I do think mathematicians, especially if they're good enough mathematicians, have the ability to build in qualitative factors into any model. And what this response is by really the Deans of Medicine group that advises GEMSAS, not so much by GEMSAS themselves, is that they've kind of taken, for the most part, a pretty binary response to the way they're going to deal with marks for this year. And with that said, I feel like part of the problem here is that there wasn't homogeneity, to kind of steal Tom's rhetoric, around their responses. We saw different responses for different universities. If they all had have said, you know what, GPAs are done for 2020, we're all being consistent, we know this sucks, but here's XYZ reasons why we're all doing it. I think people may have actually taken that better than the spectrum of different responses from the universities. So what effectively happened was, with this spectrum of responses, we had everything from, I think, the completely liberal approach of someone like Griffith, where they said, you know, you can choose, opt in, opt out, your discretion. If COVID has affected you, we're going to be considerate of that. If you want to discredit those results from your overall GPA calculation, you can, and we'll calculate based on second and third year. Equally, if you've managed this well, we don't want to penalise you for managing it well. In fact, that may actually be a good trait as to how you handle pressure.
That's all right. I think Scott.
My Bluetooth was just going in and out.
That's all right. Yeah, you're back. I can hear you.
So you can opt in if you think that you want to include the score. The other side of the spectrum is the universities kind of like Melbourne and I think it's ANU, that are being a bit more paternalistic around the fact that, no, these scores are not good indicators, whether they're good or bad. As a result, we're taking a response that we're not going to include said scores. And that's really where I think the frustration comes from, is that some unis are, you could argue, are being more compassionate and more allowing of the autonomy of the student, and others are being less compassionate, more binary, more paternalistic. And some of the comments that allegedly were said on the webinars around the fact that, you know, we don't need to pander to the market, also indicates that the position is a pretty immovable one. With that said, there have been updates around that. So nothing's made it to the print media as yet, though with that said, the petition that was started is growing continuously. It's about 6,500 signatures as of today. The Medic Guild, which is more of a postgraduate media outlet in the medical space, posted something by their reporters on this, because they felt that it's something that the doctors would like to know about. And look, if this continues to become a thing, there could be one of the print media agencies could pick it up. But nonetheless, I think my position, at least, is a little bit different. I believe that you should have the right to opt in or out, because if we imagine that the opposite paternalism was taken, that we will take your scores this year, but you can apply for special consideration, there would have been lots of people applying for special consideration because COVID affected them. And I think everyone would have acknowledged that COVID potentially affects them. So why not be able to apply for special consideration kind of in the other direction? That's kind of my rationale, is that if you coped with it, good. If you didn't, you didn't. And there's no necessary advantage to just using your first and second year scores. I've spoken to a lot of the tutors actually, and we all kind of agreed if we'd used only our first and second year scores, we don't get interviews. Third year is where a lot of students mature and bring their GPA home. So yeah, kind of penalising those students, I think isn't appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And to stop just being the neg for the point of it, I tend to agree with some form of either opt-in, opt-out, or like a more definitive, like removing GPA entirely. Like if their argument is that it's it has become unpredictable because the third year or the final year results this year, 2020, is challenging to kind of grade in this environment, then why not? Then it also introduces a bunch of other problems, right? Because if I'm a student that, like myself, I was actually one of these students, studied maths and did a bunch of hard subjects and had planned to do third year to get my GPA up. It's not really fair. Like I'm, I like to think that I'm a good doctor. So, it would have been a bit unfair for me to have been disadvantaged for exploring some maybe more challenging interests, whilst my plan all along being to kind of save my GPA in my final year. So something more decisive, which would also be controversial, but actually makes more sense to me, would actually be to completely remove the GPA altogether. But I'm sure, depending on whether that is a good or a bad thing for you in the crowd, you probably agree or disagree with me accordingly. But I guess, yeah, my tendency with these things, and I'm actually writing a piece for Medic Guild at the moment about how COVID has impacted medical education. Like post-medical, like once you're actually a doctor. And my tendency with these things is I do think there is a bit of a tendency in medicine, especially once you graduate, to, I guess, be a bit anarchist in a way, dare I say it, in that, like, if anything goes wrong or anything is out of our control or anything goes against the rules that we've been given, there is a tendency to kind of revolt, sometimes irrationally. But I think here that the revolt is really reasonable. I think the medical schools, like some of the statements got, especially from Trumbull and others, have been pretty appalling and just lack empathy for the situation that so many students in, how much they invest, whether it's with us or with others in this process. So I guess overall, like, I'm for giving students their autonomy, whether that's opt-in, opt-out, whether that's removing GPAs at a more paternalistic level, whatever it is, it definitely isn't having every school dealing with GPAs in a different way. I think we agree on that.
Yeah, and there's a couple of questions coming up in the Q&A as well, which kind of allude to, I guess, the trickle-down effects for this, because some of the explanations around why the scores are not being considered should carry over into future years. So it wouldn't just, like, if you're a first year student, or if you're a second year student this year, then it would still affect your overall GPA if you're going for 2022 entry as well, assuming that they take this continued stance that the scores are not reliable scores. So those units will be either discounted from your overall GPA calculation, or something to that effect.
Yeah, I do think the only way they can, again, going back to the rational kind of part of this, like, whatever stance the universities end on for this year, for how they're dealing with the units, will have to remain for future years in exactly the same way. Otherwise, it's completely, what's the right word? Like, it's just unfair, right? Like, they're changing their measuring stick literally for the same units in different years, which would be even worse than what they're currently doing.
Correct. Yeah. So, there are downstream implications. There's also some questions here around higher degrees, so honours and masters and what have you. It really depends on where the honours and masters is and how you're doing it. So, for example, an honours by coursework, they may say actually the grade's unreliable because coursework has been what's largely affected. If you did an honours by research and you were still able to complete your thesis perfectly fine, there was no coursework component, and you can get a letter saying you're at a high distinction level, tracking for a high distinction, you might actually be okay to petition that. But that's more the caveat that higher degree students have around the way that they study. Even then, I do think some unis are going to be more accommodating of that than others in this current climate. Okay. So, yeah.
All right, let's keep going.
Yep.
So the result, I guess, Macquarie obviously changed the way they're dealing with GPAs, and it's okay. But I would hope that we see some broader shifts based on the number of students. You know, like last year, only around a little bit more than 4,000 students put in GEMSAS applications overall. So to have 6,000 to 7,000, you know, virtually double the number of applications in 1 year, all petitioning for the same change. Although obviously, you know, some petitions might not be from this intake, it's still it's pretty shocking to me in a time of much civil unrest around the world that they wouldn't take at least some notice of this, especially because giving students the autonomy to opt in and opt out for the universities is of effect like no consequence to them at all. It just seems like a power flex, but I mean, I wouldn't put it past them to just ignore it. Yep. All right. So I've seen a couple of questions on the Q&A. So what if I'm not in third year? You know, what's going to happen? So if you're in second year or you're planning on taking a gap year and applying in 2022 or honours in future years, we're to some degree we're on standby, right? So we don't know exactly how they're going to deal with it, but Scott and I have alluded to it already that whatever is the final say on how they're going to deal with 2020 units for GPA, I think will remain for whatever period they're valid. So basically until 2023, they'll continue to count 2020 as this anomaly, and they'll probably ignore it if they continue on their current trajectory, or they'll let people opt in or opt out for the whole period through which it would be valid for GPA calculation. And I guess we've plugged it a couple of times, but we can copy in, Scott can copy it into the chat, just a link for the COVID GPA calculator. It's just on the interview website. So we will update this GPA calculator as the updates come out from different universities. So you'll be able to calculate the most accurate GPA that you can based on the latest rules. Something we put together relatively quickly just to see what the impact would be for you. I think a couple of other important questions. So how will they deal with the second semester units? So I think, and like my reading of the way that University of Melbourne and Deakin are planning to deal with the units is that they're planning to just exclude any units that have been affected by COVID. But interestingly, on the webinar the other night, they said that they would be including units like summer units in 2020 that were not affected by COVID. So it's interesting, like if things go back to normal, like status quo for the universities anytime soon, especially in time for second semester, if there's any resemblance of a normal 2020 SEM 2, there is a chance that they would consider those units for future GPA calculations. So let's say you're applying in 2021 for 2022, there's a small outside chance that they might include 2020 semester 2 results in that GPA calculation, if it was normal enough that the universities consider it worthy of including the calculations. But my reading of the way that it currently stands based on the GEMSAS guide and the various amendments is that they're just discounting the year entirely, which is even worse in some ways, given how likely it is that we will have some semester 2. All right, let's keep going. So you guys can find the latest, on this Facebook group. Scott, if you jump on the slides, it's in the comments, but maybe just share this in the chat for those that are that
already did.
Pardon? Yep.
Already did.
Awesome. So if any of the participants that haven't seen this page and the group and all of the things that people are doing to try and get the attention of the powers that be sure to jump on that page and have the impact heard. Maybe we'll just pause on GPAs and answer some questions. Are there any good ones that we can talk about in the broader forum, Scott?
Yeah, so a lot of the questions are around, I guess, what will happen in future years, which we spoke briefly about. I guess whatever position universities take around how they treat the marks, it stands to reason that they will maintain that position, and they really only need to hold it for 3 years maximum anyway through. Otherwise, they're shifting the goalposts from year to year. And then I think like previous years, people would be feeling quite upset that's been shifted and changed. And there's also sort of a question around, I guess, given some of the challenges around the GAMSAT being online this year, how, as we were kind of saying before, and I certainly agree with you, that the GAMSAT is a better indicator than the GPA anyway. But we've had a pretty arduous GAMSAT run that we're still in. Like, there's elements of reliability there around that data. So that even feeds into some other questions that are people saying, well, how will the GPAs shift? Which I almost like to handball to you, because that's something that obviously we've got a lot of data on, but I don't know, to what extent do we trust that data now, given what they're doing to their calculation?
Yeah, so I mean, it'll completely stuff up the way everyone's ranked on their GPA. So for anyone who's used our interview offer calculator with any frequency, you'll know that different universities have different sensitivity to GAMSAT and GPA. So for whatever reason, like one year, Deakin, if your GPA is a lot higher, it might have a bigger impact. If your GAMSAT is high in another school, it might have a bigger impact. The reason is rankings are non-linear, right? We've been through this in previous webinars. It's not just your GAMSAT plus your GPA, it's actually a ranking. And when you have rankings, there's a bell curve. And so depending on which students preference which schools, whether GPA or GAMSAT is more important will be different. And so I guess my instincts tell me that in general, I think GPAs will be a little lower. Because in my experience, like you said, Scott, students are well focused in their third year. And although the units are generally harder, they're also the units that have the highest stakes for weighted GPAs. So people really focus and try to increase their GPA in those final years, maybe have some regrets about the first and second years, and really focus on study to try and maximize their GPA for future applications. So my instincts would be that they'll move down a little bit. How much and how that'll impact every school is really hard to predict. Yeah.
Cool.
I think, there's a couple other pretty good questions, I think. So University of Sydney, like, have GPA changes occurred? Not that I could see on the QAC website, like the body that does the calculations when I was doing the research for this session. That being said, and I'm sorry if this affects you, but I think most students, even if this change was to occur, would still be above 5 out of 7. But if you're on the borderline for your GPA, it'd be worth reaching out to QTAS to work out how they're going to deal with these changes. Some really specific GPA questions. So just an FYI, we can't do your GPA calculation live. I know you guys know that, but if you're not sure how to use a calculator or you need additional advice on the COVID GPA calculator, we have a way to book a session with us to have a chat about your application situation. Sorry, just working through some of the questions.
What's the cutoff for UC, Tom? Is it 5 or 5.5 GPA?
It's 5.0, so it's actually dropped down.
Oh, nice. Excellent. Yep. That's good.
We've spoken about how we think it would dealt with in future years. I think for Griffith and other unis where they are including these subjects in GPA, I still think the same thresholds will apply, where you need to have done a certain number of units for it to be included in your GPA. There's a whole table on the GEMSAS guide. You have to have done at least 25% of a full-time load for it to be counted, that kind of thing.
So there's a couple of questions around whether you can use your other GAMSAT scores or later GAMSAT scores, and the answer is yes. So that's always been the case. Yeah. Another good question is, like, does non-recognition of GPA relate for second or first years this year too? The answer is yes. It relates to all students irrespective of year. So yeah, it's not a third year specific thing. I think third year is probably a bit more, and second years would be a bit more upset because traditionally those years are weighted higher. But no, it's not a specific thing. And so if you're in first or second year, then yeah, you could be affected. Well, you will be affected by this as well.
Yeah. All right. So this is a really niche question, but I think it's an interesting hack. Like if you did a graduate diploma, how would that affect your GPA? I think it would affect your GPA in the same way they currently deal with those types of diplomas. Certain schools will, some schools will consider it, other schools won't, and it'll depend on the school. This is like an epic point, Ken. Thanks for the question. What if my coursework is all online to begin with? Yeah, so I mean, again, like it's just, there are some parts of this that can be dealt with rationally, and there are other things that just don't make any sense. And that would be an example of one that doesn't make any sense. I think, again, like for a medical school, there's too much complex, like there is actually no way for them to deal with this completely fairly. Opt-in, opt-out is probably the most fair in that it gives autonomy to students and I guess balances the power structure in a time when students didn't have much control over what the universities were doing to their units. So it makes sense to me to give that control back. But if it was all online to begin with, then, you know, it doesn't really make sense in either direction to not include it or to include it. Like, you know what I mean? It's just, it's really hard. And there's no right answer. But I think that one, the fact that all the schools are taking different stances, and two, that they haven't really explained themselves in an empathetic way has been the root cause of all of these problems and the reason there's so many students signing on to that petition.
Yeah. Another thing here is if if they do remove the third year scores from your GPA calculation, the way the shift would occur in your percentages. So at the moment it's basically is it 12.5% first year, 37.5, 37.5 for second and third. So it would go to 33% first year, 66% second. That's how you would divide it. So the first year sort of value does go up a little bit. And look, that's good for some people. It's also not for others. So yeah.
All right. So I think we can move on, and maybe Scott, you can keep working through the questions, but I think we've answered most of them. All right. So GAMSAT. So more Bernie Sanders. No political affiliations at Fraser's, but you know, make your own assessment. Anyway, so yeah, it'll get worse than that, and I think, like, obviously, if the GPA situation affects you negatively, it's obviously horrible. But I do think the current GAMSAT sit and the irregularity and the issues that have been happening are more terrible for the people that it affects than GPA on the whole. So we've had proctor issues, ACE being typically inflexible in the way they deal with students, despite many of these issues being of no fault of their own. And we'll talk a little bit about some of, I guess, the positives or things that we got right in those initial webinars, things that we were predicting. So here's just a incomplete list of things that we have seen. So the proctor starting the test whilst he was still talking through the briefing, and then he kind of just said, sorry, I thought I was supposed to click on the start, and then basically like time started running out. So instead of having like a controlled start, it just started all of a sudden. Proctor was losing connection with 25 minutes left in section 2, and then finally reconnected and losing more than 10 minutes. So this is something Scott and I had, suggested. It seems so obvious that if someone loses connection mid-test, the clock should stop, and then once you reconnect, your clock starts again. But the basically it seems like it's the opposite that's true. So how basically once you start the test, it starts. There's nothing that you can do, and you just have to wait and see how quickly you can get back. And they've been waiting for ACE's email wondering how to proceed, which we'll talk about in a second. The proctor almost ended a section 1 and 2 combined session, despite not having done section 2. So that's pretty typical, like the proctors, as you guys will know just as well as us, are less than adequately trained for such a high stakes exam. And it's pretty common to have basically proctors not understanding how important these exams really are. They probably think it's just another university exam. So waiting 2 hours, so you're prepared for a test and that doesn't work, and then something about the ID that doesn't exist, and then like having to contact ASA, more problems with connections, problems with water on the desk, problems with not being told to rip up notes, what headset to wear, not using the mirror, people super triggered. So I think the bottom line is that, and I think it goes back to the stakes of this exam, I don't think Proctor U was set up to be, I mean, it's important for high stakes exams, but it's always going to be someone on the other end that is nowhere near at the same emotional intensity as you. And so when there's that disconnect, all the little things you're panicking about, it's just a formula for mistakes to happen, and it's just not as good as in person. And the problem's amplified, right? So, where Proctor U kind of let go of the pram, ASA kind of did like the, kung fu kick in that. And Scott, you can elaborate here that, for the most part, like for the students that we know personally, ACE has been completely inflexible and has not offered additional test dates if things have gone wrong. Basically, again, as always, putting the blame on the student for not having good internet, or for not being clear with the proctor, or for whatever reason. And they're being kind of inflexible with the way that they're taking the special consideration on board. Scott, do you have anything to add on this?
Yeah, look, especially for some of you that maybe haven't sat any of the proctor sessions yet, and for those of you that still have section 3 to come, the key thing is to kind of be prepared to kind of be independent. So I was talking to a student yesterday who, one of those complaints that was on the previous screen where they said start, and they said, you started the timer, and they went, oh, whoops. And the student says, well, shut up, I'm starting. Like, assert dominance. I've been making memes about this, that it's funny, but at the same time, it's practical. Like, the proctor's serving a purpose to allow you to sit the exam. You don't have to wait on the beck and call of the proctor. Shut up. You've stuffed up, but I'm not letting you stuff this up. I'm going. And then, I would be saying things along the lines of, if you don't, I'm going to pull my mobile phone out, I'm going to screen capture you, and I'm going to take your staff ID, etc., etc. The same way you would do with, like, I guess only white people can really do this, with a police officer, if they were behaving inappropriately. It's kind of a curious time to use that example, but you exert white privilege over the proctor, and push them to allow you to just do your test. If they drop off and you're still doing your test, keep doing it. The proctor doesn't need to be there. They're really serving a purpose for ACE and not you. So as long as your test is open and you can do your test, keep doing it. Some people said, oh, there was only 39 questions in section 1. That's not a problem. That's just like an interesting curiosity. You shouldn't feel robbed of one question. And if you've gotten through to the end, like, well done, because not everyone does get through to the end. So we've got to, and I've been saying this for a long time, we've got to be comfortable. Yeah, whoever wrote that, be a Karen. Channel your inner Karen. But you've got to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And this situation was always going to be more uncomfortable. Some people have had legitimate excuses and actually been responded to quite promptly by ASA in the affirmative. So as well, the way you escalate situations properly, kind of outlining that you did everything that you could, and this is out of your hands. People have been granted resits, that type of a thing, and been able to still complete their exam. So don't expect, like, you're not the customer. And I think, to be honest, those days of the customer is always right. They're dead anyway. So stop doing this I'm the customer thing. Take control of the proctor and execute your exam. And everything else, things like internet and all that, look, if that cuts out and you're sitting there and you're waiting and time passes, you email ASA and say, look, my internet cut out for X period of time. I couldn't reconnect. Please reschedule my test. It should be all right. Yeah, I think that's kind of my big thing.
It's good advice. I think one person was asking about, if I had a different number of questions or something on the test. My default with it at the moment would just be to email ASA. I'm sure they're in a special type of shitstorm at the moment of emails, but no harm in adding to it.
But I think that was around the 39 questions, and everyone's had 39 questions.
Cool.
No one's had 40. So they said it was going to be 40. It's 39.
Yeah, it is what it is. Yeah. Probably someone just stuffed up the code that generates the quiz.
Exactly. And you can't undo that.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So let's move on to more positive things. So things that we got right. So section 1 and 3 appear to be randomized from a bank of questions. That's obviously from anecdotal chats and students in our group. But again, it makes sense, right? Like, it's quite easy for ASA to have a bank of questions, randomize whichever ones present to a group of students, and then do a bunch of smart mathematics. Again, going back to that video game character analogy, you have all of these different metrics and you vet all these questions. If this person gets this question right, then their magic must be really good. And if the student passes this challenge, they must have really high HP. Or as a basketball player, they must be really good 3-point shooters. They must be really good free throw shooters. It's the same thing in a way more nerdy analogy of having, really good graphical reasoning, really good visual reasoning, really good ability to read long passages and whatever other dimensions they assess. So they can compare how students who received X question performed on a bunch of other questions, and then mathematically generate a ranking on a bell curve across these dimensions, and then spit out a GAMSAT score for each section. Section 2 has been a little more precarious, so they have different prompts for each day. The reason I say it's precarious is that obviously the sit windows do have some time there. So I guess of all of the sections where, maybe there could have been some foul play, I guess section 2 is the one that I guess there's a chance there. But on the most part, ASA seems to have taken the right steps there. And it's probably kind of untenable to have section 2 be completely random. But then if you have a set of, say, 10 prompts, if someone on day 1 gets prompt A, on day 1, if you have 100 people sit section 2, then on day 1 it's pretty likely that all of the different prompts you have in your set have already been seen. So then if they publish them anywhere or tell them to anyone else, all of the prompts will be quickly released after the first 2 days of sitting. So it actually makes sense to just have a release cycle of releasing when prompts go live. There's basically no perfect way to do this. So there's no cheating that can happen, but this is as close to perfect as I can think of. I
might just address a question, Tom, because it's a good one. It's come up here. It's come up on our own Facebook groups. It's come up in some other places. So people are saying, "Oh, look, the section 2 topics are being posted on Reddit and on other forums. Is this disadvantaging to some students? Will this mean ASA just, removes the exam and like cancels everything?" There's only a very small subsection of people that are on Reddit like the day of their ACER exam, and they're not all that focused, or they've got other personality traits that are personality traits that relate to hypercompetitiveness. So most people don't get that on the day. Even if you do, for argument's sake, no one is going to go and prep an essay based on sort of foreknowledge of the topic when you're not actually completely sure that's what you'll get. Because if you do that and you don't actually get those topics, maybe you get different ones, that would actually literally just totally destroy your section 2. So even though you might go, oh, it's going to be freedom and taxes, it's like the most you really do with that is go, okay, well, if that comes up, have a bit of a think about it. But that's the only real advantage you're getting, and that's not a discernible advantage.
Yeah.
You can make a very strong argument that a clear mind going into topics is way better than a biased mind for writing good essays. So again, I think that's just a skewed perception of what advantage is that I personally think is wrong.
Yeah. And to add to that, I still think, and I've always thought, and we have this deeply ingrained in the structure with which we teach in section 2, is that like responding to the kind of canvas of specific quotes that you're given on a theme is just as important for getting those really high scores as is identifying the theme overall. So obviously identifying the theme gets you to some level that if you just write random stuff, you'll never get to. But like no one is going to verbatim memorize all of the quotes from the prompt and post them immediately. They'll give you an idea of roughly what the theme was. And sure, maybe you can do some reading and maybe get a small kind of advantage, but you're not going to be able to, if anything, yeah, like what Scott said, it's going to kind of put the blinders on and you're going to write about the topic in a specific way rather than responding to the quotes that you're given. And I guess the bottom line is like there's no perfect way to run this test. It is what it is. It is what it is. You can't really, you know, I can't think of a way to create a test that's perfect unless you have everyone sitting at exactly the same time, which is not possible through most solutions. And ACE is certainly not going to be able to stand up a technical solution to deliver this type of thing. Are you going to have completely random prompts and then compare students on different topics? Like there are other problems that are introduced by trying to solve this issue where we should just trust students to be equitable, hopefully. And then when they're not, just be disappointed. I do like the conversation that's going on in the chat.
Yeah. Cool. There's also some discussion around what will happen with honours. Like, so let's say for argument's sake, you're in third year this year, your third year's been affected, you go on to do honours next year. Will they still remove your first year and calculate based on second and honours? Will they still kind of remove that middle one and go first, second honours so that they still have 3 years of content? I don't know. If I was the unis, I think they should use your first year still. But I don't know. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, I guess it's something like maybe they extend to using 4 years, but I think they'll probably, because it's actually quite similar to how they deal with GPAs at the moment. So if you do like a 5-year long degree instead of 3 years, what they do is they take the most recent 3 years with full-time equivalents. So if there were 2 years in there where you did like 1 unit a semester, they'll ignore those and then they'll do your most recent 3 years of full-time equivalent. So the thing that I don't know how they'll deal with is, if they're ignoring 2020, then most recent 3 years of full-time equivalents would include first year in that case. And so exactly what you're saying, right? They would just calculate it in that way. But if they include half a semester, like they could include half of your first year. But GPA calculations in general have always been kind of mystical. Like obviously if you're in a very kind of, plain, like routine degree where you've done all the units in the structured way, it's straightforward. But if it's in a complicated pathway or you've taken gaps or got credits, it can be really complicated to work out any one person's GPA. So yeah, like I said, the calculator we've made will try and will continue to be the source of truth. but yeah, it's there is a lot that's still out of our control. Yeah, I guess that's my
Yeah.
perspective.
So there's an interesting question here. What are your opinions on unis removing this year's GPAs because of the likelihood of cheating in the home setting? This could be part of the rationale around why unis say the current system is broken, and that online exams, people will have their books open or whatever. With that said, I've watched a few people do exams that are proctored, and they've done the room checks and all of that to make sure that there is no cheating, and there hasn't been. I don't think cheating is that much of an issue, but if this stokes people's fires to cheat, I don't know. We're in times of crisis. People panic and don't act the way they normally would. So potentially, but I don't think that's the core concern of the unis.
Yeah, I agree. And let's move on. So, we like predictions, so let's make a few more. So, I'm pretty confident that ASA will pretend like nothing's wrong. They'll do their maths. They'll create bell curves. Again, like it will create some unpredictable inequities, but ultimately, using lots of smart maths and regressions, you can somewhat fix some of the problems. Can you solve a situation where some people have seen the problems beforehand and others haven't? Not really. But I think scores will still be usable. I can't, as much as maybe it's a good idea, I can't see a world where the universities renege and say your May GAMSAT is not counted. I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think there will be a large portion of students that will be left needing to sit again because of various things happening. And we spoke about this at length before the sit, that, you kind of have to take this year with a grain of salt. Like, it's personally, like, I've been affected as a doctor, like pretty much I'm going to have to do next year again because I missed the only rotation that I needed this year. Like, I guess in some ways, like, we're lucky to be considering the impacts on our medical applications as opposed to considering like the human toll of our relatives and our friends and the whole society. I think like that's an important context at this time. That being said, it's not the worst situation to have to sit again. Like Scott and I can tell you hundreds of stories of students who have gone on that GAMSAT preparation journey, prepped really hard for a sit, and for whatever reason, the stars didn't align, things went wrong. And then in a subsequent sit, focus on their weaknesses, utilize a lot of the work that we had done with them in a future sit, and often end up with better results than if they'd done it on that first sit, or better results than their first sit with that extra context of that additional 6 months. So that's my perspective on that. Just have a look at some of the chats.
Yeah. So there's a good question. What if some people get easier Section 2 prompts than others? Remember, this is entirely subjective. What you think is easy, what someone else thinks is easy, doesn't matter. So they'll be able to compare it against a cohort of people who had those prompts, and I guess historically had those prompts as well. So there's no advantage, and there's always multiple GAMSATs in circulation each GAMSAT anyway. So some people do some different Section 2 stuff.
Yeah. For anyone who's interested in the GAMSAT repeating and like bank of questions stuff, we published a really interesting blog article about GAMSAT questions being repeated, I think a couple of weeks ago now, on our Facebook page, also on our GAMSAT page. It's worth having a read. It's interesting, like, and obviously Scott, from your study and from the maths I did a long time ago, like there just has to be some questions that are repeated that are kind of like the, what's the right word, like calibrating questions from year to year. So having different tests, banks of questions, there's always going to be an element of that. And then there's always going to be an element of a few questions that are kind of calibrating year to year.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of questions here that I'd like to answer because I think they're really good ones. If you're hoping to use your 2020 results for a GPA boost, would you recommend deferring an entire year to complete the course? Okay, so the disclaimer here is if this was me, and I can go full Karen mode. For those that know me, they know that I can. Yeah, not only that, even though the census state has passed, particularly with some of the comments from some of the unis, I would say this was out of my control. And had I known this, you were going to do this, I would have deferred back there. You're not charging me for this year, and I'm deferring to next year. And I'm a consumer. You've misadvertised your product. The universities are saying the product's not as good and it's not as reliable as what it should be. That tells me that it's a faulty product. Therefore, I want my ability to repeat that product. I would be doing that. And I think that's a very sound reasoning upon which to do it. So that's what I would do. How are students meant to decide whether to apply this year if they haven't set the GAMSAT before? So if you don't have a GAMSAT score up until now, the GEMSAS portal will reopen in, I think it's after the scores come out for about a week. You'll have the opportunity then to change from an old score to this score or to withdraw your application. So they're not going to make you, especially for those that have a score, that you don't have to kind of guess between them now. There will be an opportunity in the future to change if you want to. Equally, if you aren't sitting this May season, you can't apply for next year. So this May sitting and the previous September sitting are for the 2021 entry period because it takes a full year to go through interviews and all of that. So if you're heading towards the September GAMSAT this year or the March GAMSAT next year, then you're in the 2022 entry pool intake. Do you think September GAMSAT will be online or back to the normal sitting? I think Tom aptly described what must be going on in the ASA offices right now, which is one of the most weird, interesting versions of a shitstorm that is out of their control on so many levels. In many respects, dare I say it, they kept it online as a favor to the students so that there were marks, and also for the unis so there were marks. I don't think they ever want to do this again. I think they want to do it on paper, and I think they want to keep it on paper. And this has been a great learning experience. It's also been a great learning experience when arguably you probably don't pay for the top tier of ProctorU. And I think Tom and I maybe have an interesting insight on this, is that when ProctorU was bought out, potentially there was some cost cutting done on the quality of the proctors, and they're being outsourced at an extremely cheap level because the competency sounds absolutely rock bottom right there.
Yeah. It really sounds pretty rough. Kind of like, a cheap virtual assistant versus an expensive virtual assistant.
My proctor background had the children screaming in the background. I could have proctored your test. I can support screaming children if you want. Plus, I can add cats.
Yeah. Did you guys hear the possums running on the roof? It was just like,
Wow. Yeah, and I think Brianna's hit the nail on the head. Like, there's degrees of unprofessionality here. And look, if I was complaining to a university about why I want to repeat the year, I'd be citing unprofessionality in the way they've managed it. Yes, it's a crisis situation, but you're paying for it. So, dare I say it, I look at how Fraser's pivoted to support its students and do more for less or for free. Then you look at the way the unis did it, and they cut costs, offered less, kept the prices higher or more, screwed you over, a bunch of stuff. So that's entering into my rant of private versus public education, and we don't want to go there. But I think you've got grounds to do that if you did want to do that. Cool. Do you think there were test questions? Oh, we're going to move on. Let's move on and do some more questions. There will be more time for questions later where we're going all right.
Yeah, so this is interesting for us, obviously. Interviews is something that I care about deeply, running the whole Fraser's interview division. So we'll talk a little bit about it. I just thought this GIF was very appropriate right now. Although Australia is slowly opening up and a couple of places are opening. So this is my reading of the latest GEMSAS guide. I've categorized them into unclear, clear, kind of clear, and I'll explain a little bit what I mean. So let's start with the clear. So the ones that are clear have actually updated what they've written in like a decisive way. The reason is like I have the old GEMSAS PDF and I have the new one, and I can compare when there's been a significant change. So Deakin have really decisively said that it's the 14th of September, it'll be online. Griffith have renamed their interview this year. They're really trying to be the pretty butterfly that flies away from the flock. I think it's called like the GAMSAT. It's like a rough name. Basically, they're trying to provide a name for their weird interview where they do 4 acting stations and 4 non-acting stations. But they've more or less said that it'll be on the 30th. I'd say I nearly put them in the almost category. They haven't specifically said whether it would be in person or online. But knowing about the Griffith elements, I can't imagine that they would do it online. I'm pretty certain that they're going to do it in person. UWA have come out and said that they're going to do it in person from the 1st to the 7th of October. And Wollongong have said that they're going to do it online. So you can see, again, kind of like GPAs, it's a little annoying. It's heterogeneous. Obviously, at Fraser's, we're going to deliver what we think is going to be the optimal simulation of what you will receive, regardless of which university you're going to. The good thing is that Deakin and Wollongong have persisted that they will be running the same like overall structure as previous years. It'll just be online. And the reason that they do that is because the universities run a lot of research on their medical students. They collect the scores that students get on their interviews, and they correlate that to performance in medical school. And so despite it being online versus in person, they're still going to want to run roughly the same interview that they've convinced themselves works really well for selecting medical students. I put Macquarie and UQ into the almost category because they've made updates to their description and basically like re-insisted that they're doing interviews and roughly when, but they haven't come out with like a decisive line on whether it's going to be in person and online. So they've kind of said like in between statements, like we're monitoring the COVID situation. We'll make a decision about how we're going to run it soon, that kind of thing. And then unclear ANU, Melbourne Union, UND, because they've written a similar thing, but they haven't changed the description at all. So basically, like they, as always for especially Melbourne Uni, they're just like putting it off, letting students suffer, not giving any insight into how they're going to run the interviews until the last moment. But it kind of, again, it is what it is. Do we have any questions on this? Let's have a look at the chat. A lot of Proctor roast on the chat, which is good. Q&A. Interesting. Okay. So in the webinar, they said the interview will be online. Cool. It's good to know. It's on the anonymous attendees. The only thing I would say is that for me, it's all written on toilet paper until I actually see it in the GEMSAS guide, because that's like the definitive thing. I think the person on that webinar, what's the right word? Kind of like flew off the handle and went out of bounds a couple of times unintentionally. And they
That's a great description.
Yeah, and they updated the GEMSAS guide based on what that person promised with summer units today, but they haven't updated the interview description. And it's a little hard, right? Because if I was the universities, again, trying to play the neg, I would expect that the universities would want to preserve their process as much as possible for a bunch of reasons. Like operationally, it's easier, it's more vetted, they will have internal research and stuff that they want to do in the same way. So there's a chance that if restrictions are removed in some capacity, that they'll move completely online. They'll move back to being in person, even if they say it's online. All right, let's keep going. So yeah, a quick plug. So we just started running a campaign for our 2-edit portfolio package. So it's $99. It's 100% refundable if you don't get an interview offer. So basically it's free. We're just asking you to put a deposit up, and you can use the $99 even if you do get an interview offer towards some interview training. There's still plenty of time to join. We've got 72 hours is the official number, but really students are getting their portfolios back faster, usually around 48 hours. So there's still plenty of time to get those 2 edits in. And you get access to the full application atlas with all of the resources and other things for preferencing. So if you're one of those students who really want someone to chat to about preferencing and their applications or their portfolio, and you think it's too late because you've been focusing on GAMSAT, it's definitely not. And I think, Scott, if you could shoot through the link, if you haven't already, into the...
Am I shooting through the link for?
Just for the portfolio program. It's in the comments on the slide. Yeah. All right. Q&A. Let's do it. Let's start at the top. Okay. In relation to masters, what is the difference between... Oops, I'll stop sharing as well so you guys can see our beautiful faces. In relation to masters, what is the difference between coursework or bio-research and how they're included in GPA calculations? So I can talk about GPA calculation a bit. So they're treated differently by different schools. It would be extremely boring for me to run through most of them. I would just suggest looking on the GEMSAS guide, find the master's section, you'll see how the different schools deal with it. Scott, do you want to talk about the academic coursework versus research?
Yes. So the academic side of doing an honours and masters is that you'll have to do a research project plus submit a thesis on that, usually. Depending on what faculty and department you're in, you may also have to do some additional coursework to support that, particularly in honours. So yeah, it's the coursework component normally makes up anywhere between 37.5 to 50% of the total mark. And then the thesis and your defense of the thesis make up the final 50% of the mark, or 62.5% of the mark. With masters, it's a bit more dragged out, but the research is longer. So that's both of them by research. By coursework, it's just subjects. So you're looking at 400 and 500 level subjects. They're quite advanced. Some of those subjects themselves are research projects. But yeah, you're getting graded as per normal. Depending on how much you love the content, you may actually find that it's less workload than your undergraduate. People that are super passionate about their learning, like I think Shabir, one of the tutors here, he breezed through because he just lives in the library anyway. Whereas others will realize that the extra additional research that you need to do, the degree of precision and accuracy you need to have around your statements, and it's a big step up from undergrad. It's more about just recalling facts and stuff. So yeah, you need to find out if you're a person that enjoys subject matter learning, or if you're a person that wants to work on a project and kind of independently grow. Because as well, if you're quite a scientific, practical person, you can complete your honours and your masters in significantly less time than what's allocated. I remember one of the guys in my honours lab, he was pretty smart. He actually started his honours illegally over the summer period, working as a summer student. But in many senses, he was kind of testing his hypotheses early in that project. The good part for him, though, was his hypotheses worked. And come, it was March or April, he was done. And he had time to write the most beautiful thesis. He was under zero stress. And, he duxed his department for the honours year. If you were that student and you were juggling, for argument's sake, September GAMSAT study, you just had a completely open pathway to the September GAMSAT, knowing that you also got a H1 or a high distinction in the bag for your subject. So I recommend doing it if it's something that you kind of need to do, but you kind of need to understand how you like to learn and what engages you as well, because supervisors can be a big limiting factor in honours and masters projects. If they're not the type that are very supportive, or the rest of their lab are not very supportive, it'll actually be an absolute nightmare, and you probably won't get a high distinction, in which case that GPA boost that you're after won't be forthcoming.
Yep. So I'm just looking through. So a couple of questions about Flinders. So I have to say, like, of all the universities, just being transparent, Flinders is a little bit of a blind spot for me personally. We have people in the team from Flinders that we usually direct these inquiries to. But I think in general, like, Flinders has a lot of subcategorization of their different spots, and they have a whether like you're internal or not, and whether you fit certain rural criteria or not. And there are all these subs places, and year to year, the number of places can change quite a lot. So it's just supply and demand, right? So if you have like 10 spots or 30 spots, the score for your GAMSAT for such a niche spot will change a huge amount. It might be 58 one year, might be 75 the next year. It doesn't mean everyone's applying to Flinders. It just means there's no spots. For GPA, we've had students who have looked into it. I think Flinders does use GPA in some settings, but my advice would just default to reaching out to them, because I know their information on their website isn't up to the same GEMSAT standard. I hope that's helpful. Could you deferral post deadline for honours? Do you know what's meant by that, Scott?
I don't know. I was about to type something in there. I'm not sure if you mean post-census deadline, where, in theory, you're meant to pay for your subject or not, or if you mean post-hand-in deadline, when you're scheduled to be submitting tasks. I think this year, if you've been affected by COVID, the census doesn't mean as much as what it used to, and that's what you're going to be arguing any refunds or deferrals based upon. If it's actually after when you were due to hand in or something, though, like, no. And the alarm bells probably should have been going off a lot sooner.
I'm just going to post that portfolio package link. Sorry. One sec. Just, don't want to push too hard, but like, if you are interested, there's plenty of time. Some more questions about masters. What do you think will be the minimum GAMSAT for other unis if hypothetically UCID takes all the high achievers? So I think we spoke about this in other webinars. I think it's a good question. So it's interesting. Like, it'll probably have net zero effect on anything, because as early as last year, UQ was doing exactly the same thing, and this year UQ is now doing interviews. So it's interesting. Like, two powerhouses have now swapped on the same year. So we won't have a year where more than one school is just looking at GAMSAT. But notwithstanding that, yeah, sure, like it'll probably take a couple of those GAMSAT students that, have that super high GAMSAT score. But in general, my experience has been that UCID and GEMSAS are kind of in a vacuum. So people will apply to both and then kind of choose whichever one they want. But it might have a tiny impact on some of the higher scores for Melbourne Uni and some of the other more coveted universities. GAMSATs might drop a tiny bit, but I don't really think so. Another question about masters from Sherman. So, what do most people score for the GAMSAT? That's a fairly rookie question, but that's okay. So middle of the bell curve for GAMSAT, year to year changes, but roughly it's kind of from 55 to 58, 59-ish. That's kind of the 50th percentile. The scores to get into medicine also depend heavily on the different schools, as most of you guys will know. I've seen a bunch of questions about, like, what score do I need for what school and, like, etc. I'll share the medical interview offer calculator. I know a lot of you would have seen this already, but basically we use all the data from previous interview seasons to reverse engineer the whole GEMSAS algorithm. So do play with that calculator. It's completely free. I definitely would have been addicted. Is UQ 50/50 GPA GAMSAT this year for an interview? Does this mean that those with a higher GPA can offset a lower GAMSAT? So last I checked, I'm sure people will correct me on the chat, but I think they're still using GPA as a tiebreaker. So they're still taking, like, the highest GAMSATs Then if there's a tiebreaker for an interview, using GPA, and then using interview as the, what was I going to say? Interview as part of the score. So it'll be like 50-50 GAMSAT interview and then GPA as a tiebreaker, I believe. But because this is the first year they're doing it, it's highly likely that I'm not super up to date. So I just recommend looking at the GEMSAS guide. But it will be interesting to see what they do this year. That's a good question.
So do you think that, sorry, go John.
I was just going to say in the chat, Navneet was asking if I join the package, are the tutors available to provide feedback on portfolio unlimited times? So by definition, unlimited is not an abelian number, doesn't exist on any spectrum. So June 8th is the date that we've set to say, if you submit after June 8th, we can't guarantee that the portfolio tutors will get to you, but we do have portfolio tutors in the team that have plenty of availability to deal with everyone and anyone. And even if you submit on June 9th or June 10th, literally the last day before, we'll try to get back to you with at least some feedback to improve your submission. But like the deadline at which we can say we'll definitely get back to you is if you submit before June 8th. And it's also just about sort of respecting your tutor's time as well. A lot of these guys are your seniors, they're colleagues, so they'll try to get back to you as fast as possible. But that being said, yeah, if you were to sign up tonight, you could probably get 3 or 4 or 5 edits in. Yeah.
So question here, do you think that Section 1 2020, sorry, that's Semester 1 2020 will ever be counted for Melbourne and Wollongong? No. To be consistent with what we said earlier, the reason it's a no is because if they're going to omit it for this year, to be fair to future years, they have to continue to omit. So if they're taking this position, it stands to reason that they're going to maintain it. So yeah, I think if they're going to take such a hard line, and those two unis have, then yeah, stands to reason that will be the case.
Yeah. I think there's a good one. So the calculator on the Fraser website is buggy. I get a higher chance of getting in as I decrease GAMSAT score. Yeah, so I can explain that one. So especially for portfolio schools, it's really challenging to reverse engineer. So like when I say we reverse engineer, we're not literally GEMSAS. Like otherwise we would just replace them entirely, which I mean, I'm sure Scott would be for. I mean, Karen. Anyway, yeah. So the reason that it's a little complicated is it's kind of inverse to expectations. So if you get a really high GAMSAT, your chances of actually getting an offer at UND and Wollongong actually go down. That's based on our mathematics. I think the reason there is probably there's some correlation between the height of your GAMSAT score and the strength of your portfolio. And I think that this specific question is, I'm not really sure to how to use portfolios. That's why you would do our portfolio program, small plug, and we will give you the percentage scores to put into that calculator. But just play around, like it is something we've created off our own backs. It works best for the universities that have more objective criteria. But I think Notre Dame works relatively well if you put reasonable questions in. If you put really high scores or zeros, at each end it's going to break. But if you're roughly in the range, it's pretty accurate. Another good question about the interview calculator, Delaney, thanks for that question. Why does it seem like it's harder to get into Deakin than Melbourne? The reason is because it actually is harder to get into Deakin than Melbourne if you have no bonuses. So if you have no bonuses for your GAMSAT and GPA, which is how we use the calculator, assuming you had no bonuses, your GAMSAT and GPA to get into Deakin will actually be higher than Melbourne. It makes no sense because virtually everyone who gets an interview offer at Deakin has some bonuses. But that's why the maths on that is a bit broken. I think next year we'll try to work out how to add an option to pick the bonuses that you have.
So I'll answer this question. Mm-hmm. So is ANU still going to increase our score by 4% for doing an honours by research in 2020? So firstly, for honours, According to ANU, it's actually 2%. The Masters by Research is 2%. The PhD is 4%. So that's the way they structure their different bonuses according to higher degrees. So yeah, but it stands to reason that so ANU's position was they'll look at 37.5 FTE of this year, I think it was, in the announcement. So I think completing the honours one way or the other, irrespective of the grade, you'll still get that 2%. If it's done, I think according to the publication, by December 31 of that year. So that would need to be of this year.
Yep, makes sense. All right.
So I got another, I might just chime in quickly on this one. Good GPA plus good portfolio plus fair GAMSAT equals UND offer. I would say no. Good GPA, fine. Fair GAMSAT, fine. But if that's the case, then you need an excellent portfolio. Over the many years that I've been a Karen in this situation, I've seen a lot of portfolios. And the reality is a lot of people that are tending towards a career in medicine have some absolutely fantastic life experiences and a history with service to the community, all sorts of different things. So I would actually say a good portfolio is not enough. It needs to be an excellent portfolio because they're getting enough portfolios, that's for sure. So yeah, good, no, not good enough. Needs to be great. You need to be, it needs to be the type of thing where you think you can walk in there and kind of demand the job. If you can't, if you think you're middling, reality is you probably are. And they really like a good portfolio.
Really like this question. Sorry, I'm running out of voice, everyone. Do you think UniMelb removing prereqs in 2022 will increase the GPA and GAMSAT cutoffs? So in short, yes, because it's just supply and demand, right? So, you have a supply of students and let's say there's 2,000, and because of the prerequisites, 1,500 can apply. And now in the following year, there's no prerequisites. So now all 2,000 can apply. So that's one way to look at it, like in a really kind of simplistic way. I guess the other, like the complete unknown is what the fact that there'll be no prerequisites means for how students choose different units. Also, whether the 500 that were excluded from having prerequisites, what types of students do they represent? Are they the ones with the highest GAMSATs and GPAs? So overall, no one really knows. In 2023, you can look at our interview offer calculator. But my guess would be it would, very marginally maybe be a bit more competitive. But yeah.
I'm going to go that it will stay the same. And part of my rationale is less about the prereqs and more about what the 2022 model represents as far as an attempted culture shift by the University of Melbourne towards recognising prior learning and having a more well-rounded cohort. If that's the case, then they may actually be a bit more thorough in the way that they assess people. And there could be people that have some very, very good prior learning and very strong backgrounds that they're interested in taking in and maybe would have a slightly lower score. So that could be a factor as well. But I think what that will mean is that it will come out as being roughly still the same in the wash, just a slightly larger distribution of scores.
Yep. Makes sense. All right. A couple of questions about what's a bonus. So just very quickly, definitely look at the GEMSAS guide, but specifically for Deakin, if you fit a bunch of different criteria, they give you a percentage bonus on your application. And to move on to the next question, it actually has a huge impact. So if you think about 2% doesn't seem like much, but especially if you're getting close to getting an interview offer, you're kind of like, if you think of the bell curve, you're kind of on that like pointy end of the bell curve. There's, there's everyone's really closely stacked. And so a 2% move is, if your GAMSAT is 65, a 2% move is moving your GAMSAT 1.3 higher, which in the stack will move you like a huge amount up in terms of like kind of raw rankings. So that's why the bonuses have a huge impact, and not everyone, but like virtually everyone in Deacon's cohort has some bonus that they've used, whether they were Deakin students or professionals in the past, because especially if you're getting like 4-6% bonuses, you're really moving like 2 or 3 up in terms of a GAMSAT score, like as a way to explain it. That's not how it works exactly. The bonus is actually applied to your rankings, but just as a way to conceptualize it, like if you're getting a 6% bonus and you have a 65, then that's suddenly like a 71 or like a 70. Yep.
Cool. There was a question here that I thought I would just take quickly and give Tom's voice a break. So how likely is it the unis will listen to the petition outrage and change their minds? So my answer is, Macquarie's already caved, which was good. They're moving to, I think it's an opt-in, opt-out model. Others could cave as well. The reality is there's some very strong unis that won't. As Tom alluded to, I don't think Melbourne will. They'll fill their med cohort, and their position is more of a, if we can fill it, we don't care prerogative, as was alluded to in their webinar, which is a shame. Wollongong seem to have a very strong position. I'd like to think, given that they have some pretty cool heads and pretty empathetic people within there, and they're a cohort that's very well known for, really loving the experience, loving the professors, and the professors having a lot of empathy towards students, that when things cool down and maybe the pressure comes off a bit post the actual GAMSAT, they may actually reconsider. But I wouldn't be expecting a shift out of Melbourne, and to an extent out of Deakin either. They're the two that I think are just going to sit. It's a bit of a shame. How much of a difference does a 2% bonus at Deakin make to your scores if you have a GPA of 6.4? Oh, you answered that, Tom. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I have no bonuses with a GPA around 6.4 and hoping for a 68 plus GAMSAT. Should I put down Deakin or Melbourne at number 1? Tom, I kind of know what you're going to say, but I'll let you say it.
Yeah. So I guess, well, obviously Scott and I, like, we've spoken a bunch about it, but I think, so in general, we've spoken before about how preferences, like, I really like strongly believe from like a mathematical case and from like these algorithms work, that putting some high preferences that may be slightly out of reach don't really matter too much. So I would just put them in the order in which you want to go to those schools and put them as the 2 highest preferences. So assuming you want to go to Melbourne Uni, maybe put Melbourne 1, Deakin 2. I wouldn't try and game your preferences. I wouldn't try to put one above the other, because it's not going to make any difference in the grand scheme of things. And I would highly recommend watching our applications webinar that happened a few months ago, if you haven't seen already, for a more detailed kind of deep dive on that.
I intend to apply to Deakin and was going to apply a bonus prior clinical experience. However, the cover sheet did not pop up during the application process. I'm not exactly sure what that means. Tom, because I haven't been in the GEMSAS portal for a while, when you apply to Deakin, do they give you checkboxes for which bonuses you believe you are?
Yeah, so I know that you have to submit some supporting documentation, but I can't remember. I think you have to pay for your application and like get to that stage. Oh, cool. Simone, the cover sheets don't come up until you have paid. Yeah, so So you actually have to like
Thanks,
progress.
Simone.
Perfect. Yeah, so after you pay, you can find the sheets. And supporting documentation only appear after submitting. There you go. Crowdsourced. So you will have to support your position that you fulfill the criteria, and that will come up after you submit. Makes sense.
Yeah. How do we know if we should bother applying for portfolio unis? I've got a pretty fixed position on this. If you don't know if your portfolio is good enough, either it's not good enough because good people know, or you're just being really harsh on yourself and you need to give yourself a fair go. Hopefully it's a case of the latter, and you should talk to someone about things that you could put on there. The other thing to remember is portfolios aren't, I guess, like what you think they are in high school, where it's like how many captains have you been, how many awards have you won. It's about track record, and it's about showing a consistent display of the particular attributes and values that they're looking for. You can do that working at Gloria Jeans. You can do that helping out community. You can do that, and I've seen this a lot, being a parent. So you've got to, dare I say it, sell yourself and how you fit with those attributes more than it is, I guess, traditionally what we think of from an award sort of perspective.
Yeah, there are a bunch of questions about specific cutoffs, so I can just like kind of quench them.
Yeah. Yes.
So definitely use the interview offer calculator. It's earlier in the chat if you scroll up. For Deakin, you have to apply the bonuses to your GAMSAT and GPA. Whatever bonus you're entitled to, just halve it and apply 1/2 to GAMSAT and 1/2 to GPA. So an example would be like if you have a 2% bonus, increase your GPA by 1%, increase your GAMSAT by 1%, just round up and input that into the calculator and you'll get the correct cutoffs. There actually are no cutoffs. It's like it's just a slightly flawed term. So they're ranking you on GPA, they're ranking you on GAMSAT. Those are two bell curves, and then they're using a combined score from those two bell curves to give you an interview offer. So really it's just a gigantic bell curve, and cutoffs are the wrong way to think about it. It's non-linear. There's no strict cutoff after which you get an offer for a given score. So just try the calculator. The calculator has the intense maths to do those calculations. For dentistry, optom, and others, we just don't have enough data. We prepare students every single year for all of them, but we don't have the same volume of students to, with accuracy, say exactly what the scores are. The bottom line is it's definitely lower than med. How much is hearsay, but at least 5% lower scores generally.
Is it harder to get an interview from UOW versus UNDA if you're not a rural student?
Yeah, so that is a good question.
I'm just going to be controversial and say yes.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it kind of depends. I read that as like compared to like another uni, but compared to a rural student, yes, definitely.
No, it is compared to another uni. It's compared to UNDA or like the UNDs.
Oh, right. If you're not,
So basically, another way of framing that would be: is rurality more important to Wollongong than it is to UND?
Yeah, sorry, I'm so fried. Yeah, it is definitely. So for anyone who's been to Wollongong, and I've worked in Nowra, it's kind of in the sticks, and like a lot of the clinical schools are rurally based, and like Wollongong takes the curation of their students to the next level. Like it's 50% interview, 50% portfolios. They're really clear that they care about being rural. And yeah, it's like, I don't even think they're just transparent about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So Tom, do unis see our preferences?
Definitely not.
Definitely not.
I have to like, I don't know. I have to believe that they don't. I'll explain why. Yeah. So again, like going back to this stupid algorithm, right? Like you got students on one side, medical schools on the other side, something happening in the middle that gives the students to the medical schools. And you've got all of these criteria that they feed into the top of the machine, right? Like if you've got a Mensa and then all the, I don't know, attachments at the top, GAMSAT, GPA portfolios. it would just completely break like the algorithm if the schools were using the result of the algorithm to try to also adjust which students they picked. It's kind of like in coding, like if you got into like an infinite loop, because like you're using the end result in the formula that's creating the result. So then it's just like an infinite loop, and it creates all these biases that would be extremely problematic. The one thing that we do know happens is that if you apply for University of Notre Dame, there have been instances where um, you miss out at University of Notre Dame Sydney, but you didn't preference Fremantle, but then you clearly scored really highly, but just missed out on University of Notre Dame Sydney. And they've actually called some of our students and said, hey, we don't have a Sydney spot for you, but we really want you for Fremantle this year. And that was actually before offers came out. I think Notre Dame and probably Wollongong as well are a little cooked. Like they'll kind of, rather than just like following the objective kind of parameters, if they have a student they really want, going back to that curation hypothesis, they will call and like try to make it happen. But for most of the other schools where they're just using scores and, you know, obviously all the ethnic and other considerations that they make, I still think it'll ultimately just spit out the result.
Yeah, and from a mathematical standpoint, like that rule has to hold for the most part. But the reason why I believe in the case of Wollongong and UND they do is because those two universities particularly are interested in qualitative factors, arguably much more than quantitative. And this is why you see a lot of people with great GAMSATs and great GPAs, and in my opinion, good portfolios, not even getting interview offers, and people with lower scores and even similar portfolios, but could be older, getting offers. Like there's a lot of other variables that they're taking into account. And one of them is that you want to be there and you want to go through the course. So looking at your preferences then does become a factor. And I think this is part of the black box that we don't really know about when it comes to how GEMSAS supply that information to the universities. What we do know is they supply it differently to each uni. Each uni is allowed to ask for kind of different things that go into that. And look, if it was just scores, there'd be no need for all of your personal information, what spots you're willing to take, all of that sort of stuff. But that's optional. As Tom said, most of the unis are more interested in combined scores and your metrics and what have you. Wollongong and UND, the way I would describe the way they put a cohort together is they curate it. And if you look at the Fremantle cohort and the Sydney cohort, they often have a lot of mirrored aspects between them. So there might be 2 nurses in Freo and there'll be 2 nurses in Sydney. Why? They would look at those particular people and go, well, they give an allied health perspective to our cohort. And because we believe in peer-to-peer learning as much as we do our teaching, and we're focusing on having this really well-connected cohort, having them as an asset within the student group is very useful. That makes for a much tougher algorithm that needs to move away from being purely numerical. But with that said, it's based on anecdotes as well. So there has been no formal, statement by the Gong or by UND to that effect. There's definitely trends like the example I gave before about ageism in the UND cohort. They do have a higher average age than any other cohort. And in Wollongong, they do have a higher proportion of rural or students that have come from rural settings or are interested in rural medicine than other cohorts. And I don't believe, the same way like Tom would say, like I don't believe that maths is accidental. So if you're a person that's like hedging your bets, like I've got this awesome GPA, I've got this awesome GAMSAT, I think I'll just put Wollongong at number 1. But your portfolio is middling. They're really heavily looking at that portfolio and that person. So yeah, equally putting them at number 8, if that's because you're more of a scores person, then why would it, like putting them at 8 for a uni that doesn't care about scores as much also doesn't match. So yeah, it's one of those things, but I actually think it's okay. I think those universities reserve the right to choose what they want in a cohort, and how they utilize those different pieces of data.
Yeah, I definitely.
And someone's picked it up, like there's a diversity quota in there as well. There's a male-female quota in there as well.
Yeah. I'm just going to share. So a couple people are really looking for cutoffs for Flinders. I'm just going to share in the chat. There is a table that we made, and we included a couple of the different positions for Flinders and the average scores from last year. But it's again, like I said, it's like the idea of cutoffs are a little flawed. All right. Let's keep going. Okay, so portfolio marks would make you competitive. I assume that's for someone who's getting portfolios assessed with us. I would say, so this year we've changed quite a bit from previous years in terms of like our kind of rubric. We're finally basically doing it the way that we expect the universities to do it, and we made some changes based on our stats from last year. So I would say, like, I would just ask your tutor if you think like whether or not your score is competitive, but obviously like you want to be getting, you know, at least above middle score for each of your entries, ideally. What else? It's an easy one. So are there more offers after the initial offers? Yes, there are second round offers, but they're obviously far less. It's kind of like an outside chance. So for people asking about preferencing, how does preferencing impact? I've just highly recommend looking at our Facebook page or signing up to our free interview atlas and looking at the application workshop video. We literally spent like an hour explaining how preferencing algorithms work. The bottom line is there are extremely rare circumstances where someone has to have identical scores to you in every single way, be an identical candidate, and the only thing to split the two of you is preferencing, then you would miss out. But that would only matter if you were the last student on the list for interviews. Because if you were, you know, the second last, then they would beat you, but then you would still be in the interview list. So it's a very, very rare outside chance that you would miss out. But that doesn't mean you should preference like crazily. You should put a few preferences that may be slightly outside your range, and then the majority of preferences should be in order of where you want to go. Don't need to overthink it too much. This is an easy one. Griffiths GPA, why is it so high? In previous years, it's been so high because all of the students in Brisbane, for the most part, have wanted to go to UQ. UQ has only looked at their GAMSAT. So students who have had relatively competitive GAMSATs and really high GPAs that in any other state would have gone to the most competitive school, i.e. Melbourne Uni or UWA, those students actually miss out because they don't have the super high GAMSAT they need for UQ. So Griffiths GPA is kind of falsely elevated. And also Griffiths GAMSAT is usually a little elevated as well because students in Brisbane typically take GAMSAT so much more seriously because of how important it is to UQ. Yep.
Is there a difference between preferencing UNDF versus UNDS? Do they rank students the same way?
That's a good question. So typically UNDS is more challenging to get into compared to UNDF. I don't know, you know, I don't work for Notre Dame, but based on this whole idea of them calling different candidates, I am strongly in favor of them having some unified list where they're, you know, assigning offers to different students that fall in different ranking based on preferences and a bunch of other things. But that seems like what they do.
Yeah, and all the inside info I have, and I don't work for Notre Dame, but I know people that do, and I know people that have, more importantly, is that they do. And they're also trying to get like I alluded to before, that mirrored cohort, so that they have that sort of same quality set going through. This is a good question. This is a very good one for you, Tom. Does the extended rural cohort at Melbourne get the same internship as unbonded CSP?
Um, my ears will never recover. Your microphone spazzed out, but I know what question you're asking. Does the extended rural cohort at Melbourne University get the same internship? Yeah, it's pretty much the same deal. So the way it works, just a very quick revisit is, if you study medicine in a certain state as a local student, regardless of what type of position you have, whether it's bonded or full fee or CSP, you're treated as priority number one for getting an internship. So you're basically guaranteed to get an internship, and you're not treated any differently. Even so, if you're an international student, you're treated as a second priority after local students. And then if you move interstate, you're treated as a third priority. So that's how that works. But yeah, so that's the thing, like the different place positions, obviously full fee is an important financial consideration, but like overall, it's actually like doesn't really matter. You should just take whatever place you can get.
Yeah, to extend on that, is my mic working again? Yeah. To extend on that, one of the good parts about UND is they have a real network of hospitals that they're affiliated with. And it is possible to do your clinical years in other states, or clinical placement in other states, or your home state. From my understanding, that doesn't differ based on whether you're in UNDF or UNDS. But there is a bit of competition for that. So some people get it, some people don't.
Sorry, I realized I was muted, just talking to myself. Yeah, I think so. It is actually a little different. So University of Sydney has a clinical school at St. Vincent's in Melbourne. So we actually have a couple of tutors that did literally only 1 year in Sydney, come back to St. V's, all based in Melbourne and Victoria for the rest of their clinical school. I think from memory, like they're actually not the most sought after. So if you're, as long as you're Melbourne based, they'll usually preference you above like a Sydney based student who just wants to live in Melbourne for a while. So yeah, it's a really good option for Victorians who might not be in the Melbourne or Deakin kind of category.
Yeah. So good question here. Why are the full fee places so much more in Macquarie than UNDS? Macquarie is basically bond, except they're part of GEMSAS. They're a private university. They're not a public university. And as a result, their fees mirror that of private universities, so they're much higher. The upside of that is, one could argue, therefore, I don't think we can necessarily say this with Macquarie yet, but private universities in theory can hire the best lecturers, hire the best teachers, build their own hospitals on campus, all of that stuff outside of government funding. So they're not as limited by that in what they can do. And usually the quality of teaching and whatnot in those degrees is higher. But Macquarie is still very new to the medicine game. I'm not sure, Tom, if you know this, but I remember at least for the first year that they were offering their degree, they'd still not been recognised by the AMA. Have they been recognised yet?
Yeah, so I think they have. So last I heard, and please confirm in the chat if you know this is official, but last I heard, like the first years that went through the interview program that ended up getting in, they had said that the faculty was working really hard on getting accreditation, which we'd hope, obviously. I think they have some provisional like registration like agreed, at least at some level. But yeah, I'm interested to hear if anyone has heard otherwise.
Good question here about applying to universities multiple times. Look, and again, for the portfolio unis, they kind of do take note of this. There's even, instances on record where the applications person has kind of said, look, persist and please come back. We do hope to see you next year, i.e. you were very, very close. So yeah, look, you've had a couple of interviews, try again, and just think about each of those variables that are adding up to you getting a spot, kind of what can be done. And in my experience, it's the thing that it normally isn't is the cover letter. The cover letters pretty generic across the board. But it could be just an extra year of adding to your portfolio. It could be as little as one movement of a score in the GAMSAT, or it could be some slightly better answers in your interviews. The fact that you've already been there means that you're around the mark. So hopefully it's only an incremental improvement that's required.
Yeah, makes sense.
The question here is there any info about Bond University Medicine? Yeah, I mean, Bond have a trimester. It's trimester, I think. Yeah, trimester process, and they have a different sort of intake period in the year. Sort of mirrors the Northern Hemisphere, to be honest, more. It's full fee. The requirements to get in are much lower. But yeah, it's an expensive degree. With that said, people that are in it, they like it, they have no issues with it, and you're pretty much guaranteed employment on the other side. So that's one of the good parts, because at worst they can put you in their own hospital. But it's expensive.
Yeah, and also, sorry, we do have a couple of Bond people on the team, so reach out if you need any help. All right. A couple of questions about like UK applying to international universities. Scott, do you want to jump in there on that?
Yeah, so we will be having a webinar about this very soon. We haven't advertised it yet because we know that you guys all have heaps on your plate. But I did a lot of traveling last year to the UK, to the EU and whatnot, understanding the international university landscape. We do have a lot of ex-Fraser students that are studying at those universities. And of course, because we operate in London, we have a lot of students studying in the UK. So I guess the main difference that explains the differences in GPA and GAMSAT score over there, though, to be brief, is that you're in the NHS, the National Health Service or National Health System. The pay isn't as good as here, and neither is the career trajectory projection. And there's still existing, I think, that archaic culture that Australia's trying to move out of now, where doctors are just really, really overworked and as a result, underpaid when you look at their per hour sort of commitments. So as a result, when people apply to medicine over in the UK, they tend to look at a little bit more from, dare I say it, a more mature assessment of the entire impact on their life perspective. As a result, it's not that popular. People that are doing at that GAMSAT level are probably better served to just dive into their career, even if they're not absolutely in love with it, because the NHS is a much worse system than here. So that's generally part of why the GAMSAT score is lower, is there's not as much demand. The other thing is GAMSAT doesn't work for all unis over there, so you can't do Oxbridge or King's or Imperial. They're BMAT unis. Then you have your second tier, which has a couple of GAMSAT unis in, but they're pretty much your UCAT unis. So there's a lot of different avenues, of which the GAMSAT only makes up a small part. And then GPAs over there are lower, generally speaking. So doing well over there versus here doesn't translate as well, but their requirements for over there therefore means if you're going from here to there, you require a lower GPA.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, stay tuned to the Facebook page or the emails and all that sort of thing, because we'll be doing that very soon. And yeah, not only will we be going into it in depth, but we'll also hopefully have some students on there that can actually talk about their experience studying over there and what have you.
Yeah, I think especially for people that are looking at full fee options in Australia, it is a really good option.
Yeah,
because you can live, especially if you have no dependents, you can live abroad, sometimes pay less, and the degrees are still great. Anyway, I think this is an interesting one. Sorry, complete aside, any thoughts on Australian doctor pay compared to the US? So I think it's easy to look at the US dollar and different pay rates, but I would consider these things on a per hour basis. And on a per hour basis, I think Australian doctors are paid really, really well. So you'll see that like specialists in the US, like attending physicians or residents in certain specialties get paid X or Y or whatever. Um, but the thing is that like, I'm working in as a surgical resident at the moment, which is at the Alfred, which is arguably, amongst the, I said, more challenging institutions to work at. And my like working fortnight is like 90 to 100 hours, whereas a resident in the US would work like 80 to 100 hours in a week. So they do double the number of hours and their pay rate is pretty similar. Oh yeah, a question on the chat, which is a good one about New Zealand. So you can consider applying to New Zealand, but it's actually, and you are considered Australian basically, as for all things NZ. But it is actually more challenging than the schools here. The reason is there's only 2 schools for all of New Zealand. So for literally everyone in New Zealand that wants to study locally, apply to Otago and Auckland. Is it?
Yeah, there's actually been some changes there. So it's even worse now.
Yeah.
Auckland have made themselves a UCAT only uni, and there's no lateral entry program that used to exist within University of Auckland. Because of that, every GAMSAT pathway candidate from New Zealand is looking heavily at Otago. Otago also has a rule that you only get to interview once. So once you've interviewed, you're done.
Yeah, intriguing. I didn't know that. All right, let's keep going. We're trying to get through them, guys. Going fast.
So there's a question here about what should we do with our Section 3 prep now that it's coming up very soon. Personally, keep it simple. Aim to just remind yourself of the good processes that you have for answering questions. Build a bit of a rhythm. Some people like doing a little bit of a cheat sheet more for the exercises of reminding themselves of the things that they know, or reminding themselves of the acronyms, for argument's sake, that they use for approaching a graphical question or a visual question or that type of thing. And yeah, if you want to keep yourself fit, it's okay to do a couple of questions, just almost like the way you do gamification on an app. A couple of cheeky ace questions, but don't focus on the percentages you're getting right. Focus on accessing the questions and the process. With the aim is that you can go in and just have as zen of an experience as you can in absentia of the proctor not functioning.
Yep.
A good question: if I apply to a portfolio uni and get an interview, can I use the same portfolio in following applications? Yeah, it's completely fine. And look, to be honest, in many senses, the change just shouldn't be drastic. Cover letter should largely be the same. It's unlikely that your motivations have changed massively in 12 months. Though I do think it's worth putting at the end. I was thrilled to get an interview last year, and I would be honored to get one again. I do think that I'm still of that caliber. Blah blah blah. It has a certain vulnerability and authenticity about it that translates really well. And equally, if you've just continued what you were doing for another 12 months, again, it shows your track record's increased, and that you are still the person that you said you were last year. Whereas if you've pulled up stumps on everything, then the question would be, well, how authentic was what you were doing?
Yeah. Another quick one about the UK. Which uni can we study at and work later in the AU? So the way that basically works is the AMA, which is the overarching body, and the AMC will accredit certain universities and certain courses for direct admission into internship. For the most part, as far as I'm aware, at least as it stands, you'll have to do your internship in the UK, and then there's some sort of transfer process in the UK. If you're doing your kind of like early residency in other countries, then you often have to come back and do the AMC accreditation exams, like the board exams effectively. But it depends, like I know, so we do a bit of work with University of Nicosia and a couple other unis, like we have relationships there, and they're working on some internal pathways, but we'll save that for the international webinars for those that want to come along.
I think a good one to finish on, Tom, I think it's a poignant one, because
Yep.
we get this a lot, is I want to answer that. If applying to both dentistry and medicine, if we get an offer for dentistry, does that mean we won't get an offer for medicine? And can you answer this in the context of both the University of Melbourne and the University of Sydney?
Yeah, that's a good question. So typically the applications are separate. So medicine goes through GEMSAS, obviously. USyd has a separate application. Melbourne, you apply directly for dentistry. Sydney, I believe, is the same, separate from medicine. And so obviously you can only accept one in any given year. The part that I'm not 100% sure of is whether the same university would give you an offer to both. But given the applications are separated, I can't remember off the top of my head an instance where that's happened. But I believe that they're kind of isolated processes happening in parallel, and you just take the offer. But from memory, I think from one university you only receive one offer. I think that's correct, because I remember, I do remember students from like UWA and USyd having applied to all three and then receiving one offer. So at least within the medical faculty, I'm pretty sure they give you one offer only.
And I do remember a few moons ago when they split GEMSAS into dental and med. Part of the motivation around that was there was a kind of a phenomenon in dent where people that didn't get into med were taking dent spots from people that legitimately wanted to be in dentistry.
Yeah.
So you can only apply to one or the other for University of Melbourne, I believe. And I thought it was the same for the University of Sydney. If they've reverted back, to be honest, that's disappointing, because I think if you don't want to do dentistry, it's like, I'm kind of interested. I really want to do med though, and I'll keep doing GAMSAT whilst I'm studying dent. Like, for me, that's pretty unethical. Like, you're taking the spot away from someone that actually wants to be a dentist, and you're wasting taxpayer funding. So, I hope the unis are still doing that, because I thought that was a great initiative.
Yeah, I agree. This kind of like gross, like, I'll be a physiotherapist, I'll be a dentist, I'll be like applying to everything. I meant like grossly applying, not that it's gross. Is it's not problematic. Like, I understand some people just want to work in that kind of position, but it can be a little complicated for people. Like, we've worked with people who really want to do one thing specifically. All right, so I think we've hit 8 o'clock. We've answered like more than 200 questions. So I think we'll call it there. But as always, you can just reach out on our myriad pages, email us wherever you find our emails. And thank you so much. We appreciate that at this time, there's like a moving space. There are a lot of things that are going wrong or right for individuals. And I think the best thing that you can do is just keep the faith in the fact that, like, if it's not this year, things that are out of your control go wrong, you'll still be in a position to apply in future years. You can still work hard. Your efforts will still be rewarded at some time. And yeah, I guess some of the ups and downs are just part and parcel of this process. Any last thoughts, Scott?
No, look, I completely agree. Hopefully this webinar helped a little bit in maybe bringing a little bit of closure to some of these things that right now have just come up at a really bad time. Also giving you the ability to hopefully navigate the proctor, navigate the situation there a bit better.
Be a Karen.
And yeah, be a Karen. And hopefully then you can just nail your Section 3 half. And once that's done and dusted, focus on what's next. But yeah, don't look too far behind, and just keep pushing forward. But good luck for those of you that haven't even done Section 1 and 2 yet. And good luck for all of you for what remains, and even to all of you that aren't sitting this session but are applying and navigating the GEMSAS updates. Stick with it, and yeah, good luck.
And one last plug, come get help with interviews. As always, we'll be ready for the next rush for the next week. I'll be reading lots of portfolios. So just
Yeah.
reach out. Oh, bye, everyone.
See you, everyone.
Bye all.